What will the blue areas be like, and what will the red areas be like after the coming separation between the left and the right? If you want to know, this guy's got ideas. Watch
What
this.
would the red areas be like after a separation/conflict? And what would the blue areas be like? Let's start with the blue areas. The first thing I would predict about the blue areas is that they will really try to make this multicultural, multiracial tapestry society work, and they would finally have a chance to do that without those pesky Republicans in the way. This is where the rubber would meet the road. Will it really work? Well, I guess we would find out, wouldn't we? They would likely want a lot more immigration from the third world, and the ratio of non-whites to whites would go up even higher as a result of that. They would likely eventually pass some type of reparations where the white people in those areas would end up paying reparations to the non-white people, or the reparations would just come out of the tax base. Affirmative action would be ramped up further and further. Number 5, they would pass some type of universal health care. Number 6, they would really increase the size of the welfare state. And number 7, the left's modern social agenda would be kicked into overdrive. You would have LGBT taught as mandatory in schools, for example. You might have Islam taught in schools, mandatory, things like this. So there are other predictions I can make about the blue areas if this were to happen, if they were to have their own areas to rule without any hindrance from right-wing people. But I'm not going to make those predictions here. I will just say that I think the best case scenario is it would end up looking something like San Francisco looks right now. Medium case scenario, it would end up looking like Brazil 2.0. And worst case scenario, it could end up looking like South Africa is turning into now, or like Zimbabwe already went through. All right, what would the red areas look like? After a separation, if the right-wing folks got to rule over their own land without hindrance from left-wingers, what would it look like? Well, first of all, they will very likely abolish the Federal Reserve. In other words, they will not allow for-profit bankers to create money in the form of a loan anymore. And they will establish what I would simply call sound money. And by that, I don't necessarily mean gold standard. I won't go into it. But the bottom line is the average person would be able to pay off their mortgage in 10 to 15 years instead of 30. The average debt load for the average person would go down drastically. That would be number 1. Number 2, most of the red areas, whether it's separate red states or one big kind of red area, they will have some type of updated and upgraded constitution that reduces corruption in government, makes it much harder for any sort of parasitism to happen, either from the bottom of society or from the top elites of society, because the grassroots right wing has really learned a lot of lessons from the failures of the 20th century in this area. And to be fair, a lot of left wingers point at the corruption in our system as well. And so the grassroots right wingers, if we got a chance to do this, this is one of the things that we can and must do, is reduce the corruption in government, just reduce the parasitism overall, because we now know that that is the secret to a society that continually advances. And we can do it in a way that's not heartless, where we don't have people starving in the streets, but where we don't have a massive welfare state either. And that would be another item. There would be a much smaller welfare state than there is now, while we would still probably have things like Social Security and that type of thing. And obviously, if you start to think about this, the logistics and the administration aspects of a separation like this are kind of hairy. But both sides, I think, would be interested in having to where things like Social Security couldn't continue. Things that the majority of people on both sides are going to want to continue can continue. You can either separate out the administration of it or leave some kind of a administrative body that covers the entire body of the United States geographically, but doesn't have any power to actually make any rules. It just is kind of there for convenience. There's different options of what can be done. Smart people can figure out how to do this. But one of the things the grassroots right wing would do is significantly reduce the size of things like welfare. Another thing the grassroots right wing areas would be very likely to do is to repatriate illegal immigrants. They would also very likely, most of these areas, if not all of them, would either completely stop or drastically reduce legal immigration. Because if you look at the numbers, everybody in politics knows this, that non-white people vote 70% left. Any grassroots right-winger with a brain knows that you simply cannot import large numbers of people with a ratio like that of political instinct and survive as a right-wing political movement in any way, shape, or form. So they would very likely severely limit or completely stop, at least for a while, maybe forever, this mass immigration from overseas. Another thing the grassroots right-wing areas would likely do is really try to restore a manufacturing economy and have worker-focused policies like you see Trump focusing on. And you can go back and forth as what Trump's doing really working, et cetera, but the point is the grassroots right-wing now is an economic nationalist movement. The grassroots right-wing people are not on the same page as the elite right-wingers who just want free trade and globalism and mass immigration and all this stuff. The grassroots right-wing now completely hates even their own politicians for the most part, and how their own politicians are owned by the big corporations. So these red areas would very likely attempt to put some severe limits on what these big corporations can do, and severe limits on how the big corporations are currently able to just buy politicians. There will be significant efforts to curb that, what our current government has become, which is basically just a big corruption factory. And they would try to aim for more of a manufacturing-focused, worker-focused economy and not just have everything be whatever the big corporations want. Whereas in the left-based areas where the current establishment people would very likely still be running things in many ways, you're more likely to have free trade, globalist mindset, mass immigration, and you would end up with more of a service economy in these places. The last thing I'll mention that the red areas would be very likely to implement is extremely family-oriented, family-friendly social policies. So LGBT will not be taught in schools. It will not be taught to children. There's a huge backlash against the left's social agenda by family-oriented people who tend to be, in many cases or most cases, right-wingers. So family-oriented people are going to be much more comfortable in these red areas than they would be in the blue areas, would be a prediction that I would make. So that's what I've got for you today. I encourage you to go watch my first video on this, Civil War II, Who Would Win, if you haven't watched it already. And again, I just want to reiterate, I call for peaceful separation, but I predict that there's a good chance it will not be peaceful or not be entirely peaceful. And so I encourage everybody to just be prepared for that. And hopefully the more we talk about this, the more demand it will drive for peaceful separation, or at least as peaceful as possible.
Hey, please subscribe to John Mark. He created that great content that I just clipped for you there. And you might still find him on YouTube, but YouTube is banning everybody to the right of Hillary Clinton. So if you can't find him there, look on BitChute. John Mark, Mark My Words is what his channel is called on YouTube. Good luck.